be exact. Keith McCullough is the CEO of HedgEye Risk Management and a CNBC contributor. Keith, always great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on, Melissa.
Just earlier this week, you said you're long dollar, long America, and now it's just the opposite, and you're actually 91% in cash, which is basically a money-losing proposition given where the Fed says interest rates are going to be until 2014.
It only becomes a losing proposition, obviously, if you start to find a way to lose money with your money doing nothing. But the reality is that a lot's changed, Melissa, since, really that Apple report. I mean, the world didn't change from a policymaker's perspective. So after Apple, when capitalism was alive and well, you could double profits, and that was cool. You had the State of the Union, which was wildly bearish from a dollar perspective. And then you had the double down with Bernanke yesterday, which was just basically lacking any level of integrity from a data dependency perspective. Growth had accelerated markedly since Q1 of last year. Employment was strengthening. Inflation was falling. And this guy rolls out the inflation policy. So the way that my model works, and it's very simple, inflation slows growth. So if you have a policy to inflate, and it's two-stroke here, Obama plus Bernanke, you're going to slow growth. And that's why I'm out of the way at this point.
You're watching the dollar and whether or not it'll hold 78.03. And when we see pressure on the dollar, Keith, and you think about inflation, you think about some of the metals. What's your view on whether or not there are other places in the market where you can traditionally make money in an inflationary environment?
Yeah, I mean, if this is actually what we're going to do, which I still can't fundamentally believe that after going through the soup, really, for the last 4 years, that we're going to do this as a country, like cheer on inflation trades. But you can see it, Melissa. I mean, straight up. Parabolic moves in gold, silver, anything that you could drop on your head and all that stuff that would hurt. I mean, that is not a solution. Gold going up is not a confidence. It's not going to reconcile anything that really is the American zeitgeist that you really feel behind on.
Hang on, you're making all these assertions. Just because gold and silver go up because people fear inflation doesn't mean to say that inflation will materialize. You made a very bold statement, inflation slows growth. A lot of people would disagree with that. What we need in this country at the moment is slow, steady inflation. 2% would be absolutely great. Rising house prices would be phenomenal for the housing market. We need inflation in this economy, not rampant inflation, slow, steady, predictable inflation, Keith.
It sounds like you need inflation, Simon, but I don't. I mean, the reality is that that is a dogma. I mean, first of all, you're assuming that inflation is 2%, and more importantly, you're assuming that inflation expectations aren't what matter to the market. Inflation expectations, all you have to do is pull up a chart of gold. That tells you all you need to know, and if you don't want to use that, use a chart of tips or Treasury inflation expectations. You just have to use the market price.
What about bonds then? Didn't bonds rally? Bonds wouldn't rally if they thought there was an inflation threat.
Well, that's a fair point, but that's also because Ben Bernanke basically was leaning on the long end of the curve. So if you're going to mark the long end of the curve to model to get your inflation trade, which is effectively what you're talking about, that is an entirely different thing altogether. Now, there's never been a central bank in the history of the world since Arthur Burns that at the same time tried to monetize the debt, used inflation in asset prices as a policy. And what I'm saying, which I told you in February of last year, and you probably wouldn't agree with me then either, is that ultimately that expectation of inflation will slow growth, and that by the time we're talking in 2 to 3 weeks, all the great data that we've been talking about from a growth perspective, really December and January, is going to start to slow, and it won't be magic. That's just the way that the real market works.
Keith, you got a lot of credit for being for your bullish call, which has been over the past couple of months or so.
Yeah.
And now you're retrenching on the basis of a Fed meeting, which was largely, I think, if not telegraphed, then expected. Why were you taking so much by surprise? And what's the likelihood of you shifting stance again if the Fed says something slightly different?
Well, I think, I mean, first of all, it's really interesting. The surprise to me was actually that Bernanke could be that vigilant in ignoring the core data. And again, you're talking about employment growth, GDP growth. GDP growth, Carl, went up 733% from Q1 of last year, if we're talking about a 3% GDP number, from 0.3 to 3. This guy didn't move. He's not going to move on 5% GDP growth, 3% GDP
so
growth.
You don't think
this guy's never going to raise
talk themselves into a box?
He's basically telling you that if you are a saver, you can go home and sit on that and rotate because there's nothing that he is going to do. I mean, he's going to absolutely pulverize savers in this country, and he is going to find the best way that he can to do do what Simon just said, which is help people with their levered up, fixed asset, which is housing, and or ride the gold trade. I mean, this is crazy stuff. And if you think about where oil could go from here, that's the real concern, because he knows it, you know it. What you see at the pump will slow what you have in terms of what you're able to buy with other things. And that's just called inflation on a real-time basis.
Keith, always good to see you.
Thanks.
Keith McCullough of HedgEye.
It's got a great turn of phrase, hasn't it, Keith? Puts it very well. Next on the programme, we're going to talk to the CEO of Raymond